let's be honest. Most of the potters and ceramicists that I talk to who have been making a living from the things that they make for at least a few years, if not decades, live remotely. Or rather, to be clear, since remotely now means with a computer anywhere with an internet connection, most of them live rurally. Now, some of that comes with the need of a firing process like wood firing. You can't really wood fire in an urban center, at least not legally or safely. But some of that also comes from the reality of what it's like to make a living from the things that you make. In other words, earning enough money to live off of can be hard. But as you know, or at least I hope that you might have recognized if you've been listening to the podcast here for a little while now, I am on a mission to hear the stories of as many diverse approaches to this crazy venture of making a living from the things that we make as possible. And frankly, it is hard to find an independent maker who lives in a major city who is also not supported financially by other means, like another job or a partner with the traditional employment. Now, it's not impossible. David Kim is doing just that in Chicago, and I was lucky to chat with him on episode 204 if you want to go back there. But it's hard to find. Just like finding a potter who has a family with kids and a partner, and that partner is also self-employed is hard to find. If you know somebody, send me those recommendations, my friends, because let's be honest, I'm rambling on now because I need to hear that story to know that this crazy wild ride that Francesco and I are partaking isn't so crazy. But I digress. The point is, building a business as an independent maker can be hard. And when you add on top of that the financial realities of doing it in an urban center, well, it takes a special level of drive, determination, work ethic, and grit to make that happen. All of which I can safely say Sarah Hussaini undoubtedly has. Sarah, who is the owner of Not Work Related, and I connect on a lot of topics in this episode. So many that I couldn't contain it all in one episode. That's right, my friends, settle in because this is only part one of my chat with Sarah. Next week, we'll be coming back for part 2, but not before a real quick word from our sponsor.
Hello, I'm Jeff, Executive Vice President here at Amico Brent. Over 100 years ago, my grandfather founded Amico. Today, my brother and I carry on his legacy. Our team works diligently to bring you the best clays, glazes, equipment, and more for your studio and classroom. This week's episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Please find your favorite Amico or Brent product at your local distributor today. Thank you for choosing Amico for all your clay and glaze needs.
One other quick note before we get started. Sarah and I get fired up about the necessary and yet still annoyingly taboo subjects of money and sales in the arts. And I don't know a single New Yorker who, when they get fired up, doesn't use adult language for proper emphasis. In other words, this episode does include a bit of adult language. Now would be the time to decide if you need to grab some headphones for yourself or any kiddos nearby. All right, on with the show. Welcome to the Maker's Playbook, the show where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. I'm your host, seasoned entrepreneur of 13 years, Rebecca Ikiskara. Hey, Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
I've just completely changed the energy between our conversation now. For like 5 minutes, we're going, and then it's like, now we're here.
Now it's real.
Well, let's dig straight into it because I think you and I have a lot to chat about today if our DMs have anything to hold us to. How would you introduce yourself to people listening and have no idea who I'm talking to?
My name is Sarah. I run a studio called Not Work Related, located in Brooklyn, in New York. And me personally, I I guess I would define myself somewhere between potter, ceramicist, and designer. Some combination of those three things. And maybe on a certain day, I'm more one than the other. But somewhere in that Venn diagram, I'm like right in the middle.
According to your Instagram poll recently, you were saying you were pretty surprised that everybody still thinks of you so much as a designer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have my master's in architecture. I went to Columbia, and my transition into ceramics was really unintentional. If you had asked me, 2018, actually people had asked me 2018, 2017, like, when are you going to quit? When are you going to go full time? And I always said I didn't want to do it. So I began freelancing around 2017. And I used to work full time at SLM, for those who know, terrible place to work, but not to throw anything under the bus, but I think it's pretty widely known as not a great work environment. I went from there to freelancing. I freelanced 4 days a week, and then I got dropped down to 3 and then 2. And then around 2020, I was working like 10 hours a week. And so I got laid off, as did many people. And that was the push me off the cliff moment that forced me to either go one way or the other way. One way was go back to work full time, kill not work related. Like everything that I had built, put it to rest. It goes back to being like a nights and weekends gig. Or you fully jump off the cliff, see if you can fly, see if the business can support you. And now we're here. So
yeah, I was gonna say, and now it's almost 3 years later.
Yeah.
Like we're coming up on it.
Yeah.
You're still doing it.
Still doing it.
Right? I mean, that's a huge flipping thing.
Yeah.
This is an annoying and cliche and trite thing to say, but all those statistics that you hear so much when you first start a business that are really, I don't know, kind of annoying to hear, right? Like, it's like, oh, most businesses fail within the first year, within the first 5 years, within the first 10 years. It's kind of like, okay, why are you telling me this? Is this supposed to be helpful? Like, what's, but so it's a really big flipping deal that you're here.
It's a huge deal. It's
and in Brooklyn.
Deal.
I mean, you're not trying to do this in, no offense, Ryan Durbin, but you're not trying to do this in Kentucky. We love you. We love you, Ryan.
No, I think part of what we've talked about in the past is it's super unique to be in New York and be doing this. And I think one of the things that I do is share every year for the last couple of years. I've shared statistics on the studio for the year. So we do a financial recap and share some pretty revealing numbers. Like I always share what the cost is to run the studio. And you can see, if you go back a year, you can see how much that's increased. I break down how much it costs for rent. I break down how much it costs for studio assistants, for paid help, how much it costs, for materials and all of that. And every time I have people that are like, but why do you live in New York? And it's like, I don't know, why don't you come check it out? It's pretty dope, but it's everyone's personal opinion on where they want to live. And so all I will say is that being in New York adds a level of intensity and aggressiveness to the business that I think I have that maybe you don't have to have in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. Definitely, if you're in another metropolitan city, you probably understand what I'm saying, but there is a level of aggressiveness that is undoubtedly woven into not work related because it's such a hard place to function. Ceramics is hard on its own, and I can explain why it's so hard, but doing it in New York makes it that much harder. And as much as I love my job, I'm so proud of the studio. I love my job. I'm proud of the studio. I don't have any complaints when it comes to that, but this job is fucking hard. This job is so hard. And everything that I'm going to say about this job or about not work related, everyone is more than welcome to disagree. Your opinions on it are your opinions and my opinions are my opinions. And they're based on my experiences doing this in this city. So if you hear me and you're like, no, ceramics is super easy. I'm crushing it wherever I am. What is she talking about? This is my experience only. It's my opinion. You can totally disagree with me. And that's you're right. So.
And as somebody who moved out of a major metropolitan area, okay, no offense, Milwaukee, but I think Milwaukee is adorable now. There's going to be some people who are going to come at me for the words that just came out of my mouth. But we moved from Chicago to Milwaukee for a reason. And part of that was very pragmatic. Part of that was could we have hustled and made it work to have a studio space in Chicago with a separate rent on top of on top of the condo I already had. Like, yeah, I've done that. I had a storefront studio. I did that with photography. We just didn't want to do that. And New York for me is like a completely different level on top of Chicago. Like whenever I was taking a business risk, I thought like, oh my gosh, this studio rent's going to be too expensive, blah, blah, blah. I literally would call up my friend Brian Friedman, who was a photographer in New York at the time. And he would be like, $1,500 for rent? Shit, girl, take that place. Like, that's a deal. Like, it put it in perspective for me.
Yeah.
Like, New York was there's a reason people say if you can make it in New York, you literally can make it anywhere, at least in the United States.
And someone that actually grew up in Chicago, like, the amount of times that we're like, we could just move home and we could like have everything. Because everything feels so much more accessible, even though it is. Unfortunately, everything is just so expensive. And I think, so part of the reason every year I share these things, like people ask, why are you so transparent, or just like what made you do that? I think there's a few things, like one of them definitely is that we don't have any coworkers, right? So most of us like work alone. We might have employees or assistants, but like it's not a real coworker. Yep. There's like hierarchy there. We don't really have coworkers. We don't really have a set of standards for what this job is, what income we can expect to get. We don't have anyone to like encourage those conversations between each other. So that's part of it. Part of it is like that day old question when someone's like, why is it so expensive? And you're like, well, I got to throw it and then I got to trim it. And then and it's like, screw this. Like, here's why it's so expensive. It's because it costs me $65,000 a year to keep the studio just running. And that's like the best clap back I can ever give to why is this so expensive? Like, me giving you a tally of every minute that I spent on a piece isn't ever going to mean as much as it is when you see that whole picture and you see like, okay, I didn't understand how much went into it. And I think also people, in my opinion, the work that I make it's a little expensive for like your average everyday American consumer, but I don't want to have to like defend the work. And I think that by showing, okay, these are the costs of operating, people can do that math really quick. Like if it costs her $65K to run the studio, oh, I was thinking she was like rolling in cash.
Right.
If she's even making double that, like if she's making $130 in sales, which is a ton of ceramics, $130,000 in sales, she's only taking home $65K. And the reality of the situation is that most people that are buying the work are making probably somewhere in that realm, and they're doing it by working way less.
And I mean, we haven't even talked taxes. We haven't even talked like there's so
absolutely.
many other things that come out of it. And to interrupt, but also like the time and effort you're putting together those retrospectives of cost is also lifting up so many other ceramicists and potters, right? Because there are other people seeing those numbers who maybe have never bought a pot from you, but now when they go to their local farmer's market and they see a mug for, I don't know, $35, now that's not such a big deal anymore because they're like, right. Oh, now I understand. And that's like customer education, kind of like layman education, if you will, is such a huge, huge part of, I think, any arts, like selling any arts, like whether it be ceramics, whether it be anything. Like a painter could send somebody to some of those same recaps and be like, hey, this is why.
Right. And it's like, it doesn't just put respect on my name, put respect on not work with it. It really does give, like, I think the whole industry a bit more respect and a bit more credit, and allows us all to be really proud. And it's started a bunch of conversations, behind the scenes of people that maybe I've talked to a bunch. Like, I think this is no surprise to people that are in the industry, but most of us are friends, like BTS. Like a lot of us are up in each other's DMs. People send me other people all the time. And it's like, I'm like good friends with that person. Like, I'm not living under a rock, but there is a bunch of transparency that happened in my DMs after, where people shared their income with me and I shared my income with them. And it's not comparable, right? That's like the huge curse of Instagram. We're all flattened. We make, similar-ish content. Maybe it's not the product that's the same, but we're all in there throwing up videos and photos, reels, whatever. But our real life situations are so different. So you could take my end of year total profit and then move me to a different place. And suddenly someone can take more of that profit. So on one hand, like it's amazing to compare, but at the same time, our resources and opportunities are so different. Our cost of living is so different that you can only compare so much. Right. But it's better than nothing because we have nothing right now.
Yep. Well, and, it's not, I don't think it's a huge leap for people to understand that $65,000 annual in New York gets you a much different quality of life than $65,000 in Milwaukee annual. You know what I mean? Like we effectively bought it's an old house. It needs a lot of work, but we own a place that like you can't even get a studio apartment in New York for that. Like that's just not going to happen. There's no right or wrong there. It's just a matter of like, okay, then you do have to go out. But I'm rambling because I want to get back to the idea of like choosing where to live. I mean, number one, that just shouldn't even be a judgment in general. But also number two, like who's to say, had you said, okay, I'm going to go all in on not work related. And because of the cost of living in New York, we're going to move. But then who's to say you would have still grown not work related to the place that it is now? Without this has been the thing that fascinates me. And part of the reason I started the podcast is because I was looking at all these potters and especially your wood fire community that are so removed from each other and so separate when I'm coming out of an industry that the only way I built my business was to be in the epicenter of a place and see people and connect. And I don't know what not work related would look like today if you weren't in New York City.
I think I'd be depressed.
Well,
I mean, we've thought about it a lot, right? And there's a whole world of people that make garage studios, shed studios, basement studios. If you can make that work, like go for it. I think your husband throws it in your house somewhere.
Yep.
I would be so depressed. Like I wouldn't say that I'm extremely extroverted, but I need some like human interaction to feel motivated. The days that, when you are working in a community studio, I think all you want is everyone to leave. Like you want all those people to just get out so you could have some peace and quiet, whatever. You hate everybody for like no reason other than the fact that they exist. And then when you start working by yourself, it's pretty fucking lonely. Like the days that are the best at the studio are the days that somebody else is there with me. Like the days that I have an employee, I thought would be the days that I hated. And those are the days that are actually like the best. And so knowing that those are the days that I laugh the most, I'm actually the most productive. Those are the days that I look forward to. Like I don't feel alone in the business and I feel like I have another like partner, someone to tag team with me. I know that if I had to just crawl downstairs in my pajamas, my entire drive would shift. And maybe that would be okay because I wouldn't have to make as much stuff. But I think no matter where we end up, for me, having a studio space that's outside of my home is like always going to be the way that I want to do it. I don't want to roll out of bed and then like somersault down the stairs and work alone all the time. Like we have a really great setup. I can walk to the studio. My main assistant also walks. We live in the same neighborhood. Like I'm spoiled a bit, but I also pay for it. So
yeah, well, nobody's driving a car in New York. If you don't, there's no reason to. So no. I think what I hear when you say that also is the much larger concept that is missed on the internet because there's not a lot of space for nuance on a platform like Instagram, which is it's worth its weight in gold being self-aware enough, like knowing yourself well enough to know what you need, to know what is going to make you the healthiest and the most productive, and then choosing the business model that supports that.
Right. To take that and then veer off of it a little bit, the other thing I get, I don't want to say I get shit for it, but the other thing that people suggest a lot gently is like not doing this drop model that I do. And I don't want to talk about it a ton because I think everyone knows what it is. But part of what makes this job super hard is that I get paid like 6 times a year. Right. And so I only get paid when I put out work. And for me, it's really inconvenient. Like people have told me like, you're missing out on customers. You should have work on your site all the time. Like people are going on and they want to buy something and it's not there. And I think even someone else maybe that you talked to was like on a different episode had said you should make it easy for people to buy your work. And I have not made it easy for people to buy my work. Like, it is a game that you have to play to get the work. And it's a long con because I'm trying to take care of myself, not just like right now, but long term. But people, are always like, well, would you ever consider moving away from this model or that model, or moving more towards having things available more in like a less cyclical schedule? And it's, again, one of those things where it's like, I can make it work for my brain however I want, because it's my space, right? I made this little crazy monster, and I don't have to do it how somebody else would think it's best. What works best for me is that we can have big bulk, like I can throw, I can trim, and then the studio shifts over and we do a ton of glazing, and then we fire those kilns. We put everything online. It's like done in, 5 to 10 minutes. We start shipping. We take 2 days to ship, bring out like all the boxes down, the peanuts down, everything. Send up 2 UPS pickups. We're done by Friday, and then take the weekend off if you can, and come back on Monday and start that cycle again. I don't want to be like, shit, I got an order. I got to take the boxes down, pack one box, go walk to UPS. Like, for me, the way that my brain works, I like big chunks of things, and I like that it's all dense, and I need a deadline. So I need that. Like, yeah, it's more stressful, but I think I am the type of person that needs that fire under my ass to get it done, because I will keep pushing it and be like, people are like, oh, why don't you just give yourself a little bit more time every drop? And it's like, it doesn't work like that. I'll fill it, So whatever that date is that date. And we work backwards to get everything done for that date. And I'm trying to get better. Like, I'm trying to get better to the point where I'm not unloading the night before or the day of, like trying to kill all that shit, get it done a few days early, have some time to breathe, take content, like take photos, promote the drop. But yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful part about doing your own thing. Like, there are a lot of downsides, but at the very least, I can create a system that works for me.
Yeah.
And that I can excel in. Whereas, like, if I was in an office or something, you got to do it how everyone says you have to do it. So.
And I think to say, oh, if you did a different model, it would be less stressful. Who's to say? Because, like, as you're aware, you're choosing what works for your brain. So even though there's a pressure for that deadline, who's to say, oh, okay, if you were just like dripping off pats, there was inventory constantly. I can imagine a world also where that's not any less stressful, because you're getting these like one-off pings of, the research behind, I'm going down a totally different rabbit hole now, but like everybody's concept of multitasking, and how like actually like multitasking is like the worst thing you could possibly do for productivity. And like context switching, you lose 20% of your time every time you switch from one task to a different task. And so if you were in a position where like you sit down at the wheel to throw, and then your phone goes off and you have an order, you say, okay, well, now I need to make sure that I stop 20 minutes earlier than I had planned for my throwing, so that I can go to the closet and get out the shipping materials and, like to meet my shipment deadline or whatever. Like, I don't know. I think it simplifies it too much to just assume a different model would be less stressful, is what I'm getting at.
Right. Totally.
And it's also a reflection, what I'm hearing at least, is the reality of being in Brooklyn. Like, if you don't have the square footage, it's better to use the space you have to the utmost for a given task, right? Like you can take over the space for shipping and packaging and get that done faster than, taking the boxes down from the top shelf. I mean, it sounds that people are going to laugh and think like, oh, what's the big deal about like going to get a ladder and bring it over?
It's a huge deal, because when we, like this year, we started using this thing called Toggle, which tracks like all of our hours, all of our work, every task that we do. And it's like me and everyone else that works in the studio uses it, try to. I'm not a stickler about it. Like, if you're off by 10 minutes, 20 minutes, I don't really care. It's more big picture where we spend our time. When you look at my graph for the end of the day, or even especially for the end of the week, it's not like, oh, you threw for 35 hours and you trimmed for 17 and then you did. No, it's like, it's psychotic. It's like a full rainbow. Everything is color coded of things that have to get done. And that's just running the studio on a like chunk by chunk, throwing, trimming, glazing, whatever system.
Yep.
If everything was happening at the same time, I think I would have a mental breakdown. But that's, again, it's my brain. It's like my opinion. And if it works for other people, like to do it rolling, I also really want guaranteed income. Like I am in a place and I'm super lucky that I can decide what my income is for the end of the year. I kind of know what my expenses are. And then I take that and I divide it by 6. And if there's some flex, right? If there's more teaching happening, then like the drop gives a little bit. Christmas is probably going to, like, the holidays are probably going to be a little bit bigger. But I always looked for someone that did it this way because I thought it made so much sense to me. And I think a lot of people are a little bit more loose with how they make money or what money they make. For me to be able to exist and for me to be able to survive, I want to know how much money I can make. I want to know that I'm going to be okay. I want to know that this business can last another year and it can last another 5, and that we're not struggling to be like, I can't afford to buy that brush, right? Because I think a lot of people, and this is again, like my opinion, if this studio was breaking even and making no money, I wouldn't be doing this anymore because there is nobody else funding not work related. It is just like the people that buy the work and people that pay for workshops, classes. That's the only money that's coming through not work related. And that's the only money that's coming through like my personal life. So if this made no money, this wouldn't exist.
Yep.
And
Which is just the reality.
It's a
Like,
reality, but it's not everybody's reality, right? So
Sure. Well, yes. And you and I have talked about this, that like, that's true. But also in terms of like, if people are saying, okay, I want to start a business, like that is what a business is. And I think this is something that gets like such a taboo in the arts, is like, you know, talking about sales, talking about money. It's like, yeah, guys, we got to buy groceries. You're not trying to buy a yacht.
Right. I mean, I don't care if you take away the artist tag, doesn't mean anything to me, but I run this like a business, and it is a business. In order for it to exist, it has to make money. And in order for me to exist, I have to take a paycheck. And I know there's a lot of people that have other circumstances where they don't need to. I think especially in New York City, like New York City is a place where income disparity is like higher, is everywhere. And I'm sure there's West Coast cities out there, maybe just cities across the US that can totally play that game. But it's a place where I think this is why I'm so sensitive and aggressive. It is a place where there are a lot of people that don't need to work. And that's like no shade, it's just pure fact. It's like, I'm not trying to take a jab, but it's the reality of the situation is that there are people everywhere, especially in New York City, that don't need to work. And so when you are doing something in a studio next to somebody that doesn't have to work, they don't understand your mindset or why you think or you feel the way that you do or why you work the way you do. Like there was a really sweet woman a few studios ago in like a shared studio, not a community studio, that was like, I was like, oh, I really don't want to be here today. She's like, Sarah, why don't you just go home? I was like, honey, I gotta make money. Like, this is half my job. I'm freelancing 3 days a week, but I need to fill this time. Like, you don't just go home when you're at work. And I think I'm a stickler for like, this is a job. I love it, but it is a job. And so therefore I take it seriously. And it's difficult when you're doing something on one level and you're in the same space as someone who's doing it on a completely different level. I have no issue with it, right? Like if you have resources that I don't have, that's amazing. The only issue that I have with it is when people give like the false impression that it's easy. And you see it a lot in New York City. And like, I'm only going to talk on New York because that's the only place that I've done ceramics. I mean, I did ceramics in high school, like, but I don't think that counts really. So I only want to talk on not on New York City, but there are a lot of people that are supported by their partners or supported by resources like beyond those that I have had, which is like absolutely okay. It doesn't make their work invalid. It doesn't make anything that they do not good. It just creates this impression of how easy it is to survive here doing this. That's where I have the issue, because that's when you get people quitting their jobs because it looks doable. That's when you get people that have low self-esteem because they can't do it and they can't figure out why they can't do it. And it's like, oh, well, it's because that person made it look like it was so chill. But in reality, this was just for pleasure. And they might spend a lot of time doing it. It doesn't actually have to be profitable, right? And so like, that's why I share those stats and I share that transparency because I am so fucking proud that, and not to make anybody else less proud. Like, this is just on me. I'm proud that in a space that is so expensive and so hard to survive in, like, we're doing it and I'm making the work that I want to make. And I don't think anyone owes you info. Like, it's none of my business if you got cash. Like, you know what I mean? The same way that I don't owe anyone my salary, you don't owe anyone anything. But I think it would positively contribute to this industry that we all love so much if there was a tiny bit more transparency about like what is full-time and what is a job versus what is something that you're doing on the side part-time or as a hobby or like for pleasure. It's a weird job. You can't name that many more industries that, you know, aside from like the visual and creative arts, that have people doing it as a pastime. Like nobody is just chilling out accounting on the weekends. Like you're not side
I was thinking of like a lawyer.
being a lawyer,
Like,
right? Like
let me hire this part-time Better Call Saul, like,
yeah.
you know. Yeah.
So like, and there's no shame in that, right? I've been a hobby potter. I did a part-time thing. Now it's full-time. But that shift, because I've done all three, I'm so aggressive about what it means to be full-time. And I've had people be like, but I spend all my time on this, so it's full-time. It's like, that's up to you to decide. You can label yourself. I'm not going to label you. Like, I'm not interested. But in my personal opinion, if you're not earning income that's supporting you, then it's probably a part-time thing, or it's probably something that you're doing for pleasure, which is A-okay.
Does not invalidate the work.
Not at all, right? You can have amazing work. It just helps everybody that is trying to get there see clearly what it looks like. And maybe it's really fucking intimidating when you see that, hey, Sarah has to clear $100K to even make minimum wage in New York City. Can you sell $100,000 of pottery? And if you can't, maybe just check on your job and keep it for a bit. I kept my job for years. The last thing I want is for people to quit their jobs and be like, I can do it. And then be like, I'm really struggling. So I don't know, that was a long rant, but
no, I'm like emphatically like, we are like, you're like my spirit animal. Cause I'm like, systems is my jam. Talking realistically about what like all of this is like, this is literally why I started the podcast. This conversation right now is why I started the podcast, because it's not a judgment pass. I think what we're both trying to get at is just the reality, because so many people desire to be quote unquote full time because it has been so romanticized. And we both, like you and I both like love being self-employed. Like I wouldn't give it up, but wanting other people who are looking at that to just have the information before they dive down the rabbit hole so that you're not finding yourself. I mean, how many stories, these are all like the bro tech startup stories that have completely romanticized, like, oh, I put a second mortgage out on my house so that I could fund my startup idea. Or, oh, I listened to a lot of like, what is it? Like How I Built This and like the other like business podcasts that are all, you know, some bro, I'm stereotyping, but generally I cannot think of a single story of like a woman or a person of color who's like, so I took on $80,000 of credit card debt to like take this risk to fund my business. Like, no, it's always like some white guy in tech. But you hear those stories and they've been romanticized in a way that like, oh, that type of passion and that type of risk is what is required to go do the thing. And it's like, well, no, we can just have more information beforehand and make informed decisions and, you know, understand pricing. And
like treat this like a real job. If you graduate from whatever university, except for an art is like so dodgy about money. They got problems. But other than art, if you
almost got, sorry, I'm totally interrupting you. I legitimately almost got a master's just to be able to teach a college level course on business for artists because they're not out there.
No, they're not. And it's something that I would actually really like to do. I mean, we can talk about like where I want Pasuni to go maybe at the end, but it's something that's missing so much. And in other careers, you come out and you kind of know what to expect. And in this, it's like you really, really don't know what to expect. And this is how cutthroat New York City is. The amount of kids that go to Alfred that come out and end up being nannies, that end up working in other jobs, that end up, you know what I mean? Like or working like public education for, you know, an elementary school. No shame in any of those jobs. But like, how fucking sad is it? Sorry, I'm like passionate about this. It is so sad that you had to go to school and you probably make work that's brilliant, but you don't have the resources and the information when you come out with that program to be like, this is how I'm going to make it work. You can't afford a studio in New York City and you went to school in New York State. And you could probably, I mean, I try to be extremely well-rounded, but you could probably technically run circles around me no matter how much I try to make sure like I'm on, all of the technical stuff for the studio. And I don't know, it's sad. Like there is something huge missing in education. And like, that's part of why I think it's important to talk about this stuff. Even the people that have degrees in it can't afford to do it. So, I mean, something's wrong.
There was a point, I want to say I was like 3-ish years into my business when I realized that I would have a higher hourly wage if I worked at Starbucks than what I was paying myself in my business.
And that's why we started this toggle thing, right? It's because a lot of the work I do is invisible. I think there's this huge misconception. I do want to touch on design because I think a lot of people want to hear me talk about design, but there's a huge misconception that this is a design studio. I'm not a designer, but in a year, maybe I spend a week on design, maybe 40 hours, maybe 60 hours, right? Most of that time is spent doing things that you don't see. So we started using Toggle at the studio because I think so many of the things that I do they're not visible, right? So it looks like I'm designing all the time. It looks like I spend every single week as a designer. In reality, I'm like part cleaning lady, part email lady, part operations, part HR. Like I spent a ton of time last weekend writing grants and residency applications, making an employee handbook. And those are things that happen at home. And so then they don't get documented in any way. Like my timesheets are at the studio. So part of the whole reason for Toggle, even if I just like click on and off of the time tracker, is to figure out what is my fucking hourly rate. Because there is a huge chance that some of the years in the past, I made like $12 an hour. And that's not sustainable. Like my salary is okay. And I don't want people to get hung up on the salary because it is a product of working the hours. Like the only reason the salary is doable in New York City is because I'm working 60+ hour weeks. And when you break it down to how much I'm actually getting paid, it doesn't match up to what I could get paid as a designer. Like as a freelance designer in New York City, graphic designer, you can get paid $100 an hour, right? So why would I do that if I could get paid 4 times as much and not have to be mopping the floor or not have to be like getting arthritis? So anyway, it's like a thing that I really want to know. And I would encourage everyone to try to track their hours in some way, whether it's a digital tracker or whether you just have a timesheet or whether you text yourself, like figure it out because the chances that you are working more than you ever thought you were working are really high. And yeah, you might make more at Starbucks.
And they have healthcare, it turns out.
Yeah.
All of my conversations, to no one's surprise, will come back to healthcare. And there's nothing, if you're choosing to work those hours, I think it does. I think there is an ebb and flow, right? Like when I was writing the course, for example, like if I'm in the middle of a launch or if there are ebbs and flows to where if I'm doing a brand new project, maybe my hours go up, but I'm also acutely aware now, maybe not the first 5 years, but now that has to be a bubble of time in order for me to keep, it can't always be constantly increasing and constantly going. It's, if somebody wants to work 60 hours a week and they're finding enjoyment from it, then that's great. But also being self-aware enough to know that you are consciously choosing that as opposed to just, I don't know, just not understanding why you can't sleep at night or why your anxiety is through the roof or why, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like
Right.
there are moments when if somebody's just getting off the ground, yeah, maybe you have to put in 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week to like make it happen. But understanding, okay, this needs to be a period of time. Otherwise, I'm not going to, you can't do that for 20 years.
Right. And I think part of the whole Toggle thing too is figuring out our overhead. Because like I said, the only thing that makes money is when we make work. So if I'm spending a lot of time doing that stuff that you said, right? Like designing, researching, whatever, which happens, there's a huge amount of the studio that doesn't make money. It's not billable. And figuring out how much of that percentage is my time then allows us to like figure out what the cost is of a piece. And like right now, I went through last year and added 25% on almost everything to try to capture that overhead. Because when you're running, it's such a different game. When you're running a space that is just for you and you're doing everything, you have efficiencies because you're the only person doing it. You don't have to be a boss. You don't have to make HR manuals. You don't have to have people sign things, right? You just show up and you do the work, especially if you're in a community studio. You don't have to clean. You don't have to make the glaze. You don't have to recycle the clay. You are getting to just work.
File the 1099s.
Yeah, which I did on literally January 1st. I was like, this is getting off my plate. But when you're doing it as, quote unquote, real job, the amount of time that you spend doing other things is like astronomical. And then it's like, well, who's paying for that? I'm not getting paid out. Like, I take what's left. So, and maybe that business structure needs to change in the future. And maybe I need to take an hourly rate. But the only way I can figure that out is figuring out how many hours I'm working. So trying to get the work to cover that overhead, to run the business part of it and not just the making part of it. And then figuring out, you didn't ask me about pricing, but it's something
spoiler for everyone. This is a conversation about pricing. I mean, everything we're talking about, that's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
It's like a constant struggle, right? Because I try to keep track of how long it takes to make every piece. But as you know, not everything goes perfectly every time. So it's not like 40 minutes per. It just doesn't work that way. Sometimes you make a mistake. Sometimes you don't have enough glaze. Sometimes things just like, they're variables. But I struggle with pricing, right? Because if I charge what I needed to charge on every single thing, I think some of the work would become inaccessible. And part of what's important to me for the studio is that people can use these things in their daily life. Like, I run a whole replacement program so that if you break your thing, like, I'll replace it for you outside of the drop, 10% off. I mean, it's not free, but like, it's something that I want people to be able to afford, right? I don't want to make 30 things a year at $2,500 each. And then that's the studio. So I struggle with, I think it'll always be a struggle. I think there's a misconception that people say that are like, charge what you need to charge. And then you're never going to be able to change that price again. And like, that's not true. I've changed prices every year. As the studio changes, as the studio grows, as the cost of existing grows, the prices change. And like, the reality is that most of them went up 25% last fall, because I realized that this like calculator that people, talk about, which is like your hourly rate times the amount of time it takes to make your piece added to the material cost is your piece. But that shit's fake. Because it doesn't count for anything other than making. Like, that's not how a business works. And I sound like the most boring person to hang out with, but
no, that's just real.
Right? So like, that calculator needs to be updated so badly. And unfortunately, that means that like work gets more and more expensive. And I try to keep efficiencies in the studio, but at the same time, like, my mindset for the studio, I try not to limit myself on like, oh, this is going to be too expensive to make. Like, it's going to take too much time. Because ideally, like, I want to make things that I'm impressed with. I want to make things that I'm excited about. Like, I know that I touched on this, I think, a little bit this week in stories. And I think the traditional potter mindset, and this isn't like by no means all inclusive, is that you find something that you can make efficiently, and you enjoy making it, and it sells well, and you find that trifecta. But I've never operated the studio that way. It's like a stupider way to operate the studio. But at the end of it, I think there are things that are like really unique that are produced. But then I hit that thing where there's a cap on functional ceramics, right? Part of why this job is hard, like, it's hard and it's expensive and blah, blah, blah. And labor is expensive. But part of why this job is hard is because I've been making functional work. And there's only so much that people are going to pay for a cup. It's like, I don't know. There's no solution, right? It's just a struggle.
Yep. I really want to, there's so many questions I want to ask, but I don't want to open up a like can of worms with 6 minutes left. And that, my friends, is why we have part 2. Because next week, we are going to dig even more into pricing your work, bringing on assistants, the iterative nature of design, and business and life for that matter, Sarah's design process, and the fears of sharing too much of that process on the internet. Long story short, you're not going to want to miss out. And in case you were worried about missing out, here are 2 amazing options for making sure you don't. Now, both do involve using your hands on a screen or a keyboard, so you might want to take this moment to go ahead and wipe the mud off your hands right now. All right, so number 1, if you are listening to us in a podcast player app like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, be sure you tap the follow button. In Apple Podcasts, it's become just the tiny little plus sign in the top right corner. And in Spotify, it's clearly just a button that says follow. This is a win-win, by the way, because following the show will make sure new episodes are downloaded straight to you when they come out. But also following the show is an awesome and free way of showing your support. Another awesome way to show your support for the show is to leave a review in whatever podcast player app that you are using. So before you exit the app and start putting your hands back in the clay, go ahead and consider popping a 5-star rating and tell me what you're up to while you're listening to new episodes or what your favorite episode so far has been. And then the second way to make sure you never miss a new episode is to jump on our email newsletter list. You can do that over at makersplaybook.com/newsletter. Doing so will not only get you new episode messages, but also our coveted once a month free photo tips email. Just this last week, that email went out and I shared diagrams of the single greatest thing that changed my photography. So yeah, it's a pretty awesome free resource just in your inbox. Click the link in the show notes or visit makersplaybook.com/newsletter to jump on that list. Once again, today's show was made possible in part by support from our sponsor, Amoco.
Hello, I'm Jeff, Executive Vice President here at Amoco Brent. Over 100 years ago, my grandfather founded Amoco. Today, my brother and I carry on his legacy. Our team works diligently to bring you the best clays, glazes, equipment, and more for your studio and a classroom. This week's episode is brought to you by Amoco Brent. Please find your favorite Amoco or Brent product at your local distributor today. Thank you for choosing Amoco for all your clay and glaze needs.
Additionally, audio post-production of this podcast is made possible by help from Christy Kotsovan, with promotional material assistance from Quinny Maliki. The Maker's Playbook podcast is recorded on the original homelands of the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee people, where the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. Until next time, my friends, go get back to making your dreams a reality. Because together, we've got this.